Didn't get through everything last month, excuse me. And really felt like I had to hurry a little bit at the end there. So I'd like to do a review of what we covered first, and then move into some of the stuff that
They
we
both
didn't
leave. I have a place at 10 in the morning, so
really
it's like
get
during the
covered.
middle of the day. So
Can everybody mute themselves? That'd be great. Anyway, back to what I was talking about with reviewing some things and then moving into the next the stuff that we didn't get finished last time, because there were definitely a few things I'd like to relay that we didn't get to. So I hope people understanding, first of all, the reason I'm taking the approach I have all along, whether it's articles on the website, podcasts I've done, or these the books, I feel it's important to kind of start to understand the basics and understand the underlying principles that are governing what we're trying to do, because the more you understand it, I believe the better job you're going to be able to do at managing your own training. And so I think that's really, I hope it's not too boring for people, but I don't believe in kind of prescriptive or recipe-like training, because I think it's important to know why we're doing what we're doing. So I hope it's okay with people that I took that kind of deep dive into physiology a little bit last month, excuse me. And I want to, so the few points, the high points that I want to kind of go over are I talked a lot about muscle fiber recruitment, and I want to tie that into another concept that I spoke about last month. Remember the vacuum cleaner analogy. And real quickly, that is that the slow twitch muscle fibers really like to use lactate for fuel. It's a form of sugar. It can very easily enter the mitochondria. Well, it can very easily be used to turn into acetyl-CoA, which goes into the mitochondria to be used as fuel. So lactate, instead of being a boogeyman, it's actually a good thing because of the fuel. Now, because it's really used mostly in aerobic metabolism, it benefits to have a lot of slow twitch fibers that have high aerobic capacity, so that the lactate can be taken up and used as fuel. That's the vacuum cleaner idea. Those slow twitch fibers act like, my analogy being that they act like a vacuum to suck up that lactate, and instead of letting it accumulate, where it's actually going to have a negative feedback effect and slow the athlete down. Now, I actually got a question in the past couple of weeks about this that I thought would be interesting to talk about. On a macro scale, I hope everyone could kind of understand this vacuum cleaner analogy, but on a micro scale, it also works. And so now that you have some understanding of the muscle fiber and it's the recruitment that's used to propel you in your sports. So we have these, and I'm going to use a very simple analogy that's to help people understand it. And I'm going to use minutes per mile because that's easier for me to think in right now. So let's just say we were a runner and where you have a pool of muscle fibers or motor units that get recruited to run, say, a 10-minute mile. And those are the fibers that are going to continually get recruited by the brain to do that level, that intensity of work. And so they get very well trained, both from the neurological standpoint, that your brain is good at recruiting them and firing them in a synchronous way. And they also get trained in the metabolic way in terms of those muscle cells develop more endurance. They adapt to the kind of stimulus you're giving them. But let's say now we've got this 10-minute per mile group of muscle fibers. Well, we also have a group of muscle fibers that would get recruited to produce an 8-minute mile. And they would get recruited on top of those 10-minute mile fibers that are already being recruited. And likewise, there would be, I'm using these big jumps here, but so I hope you get the idea. There would be another pool of motor fibers that get recruited for the 6-minute mile. And each one of those is standing upon the aerobic base of the fibers below it. And this model has been proposed by a number of people, and it makes a lot of sense to me. And I used it as an explanation for this person that was confused or curious about the whole vacuum cleaner thing. And so those 10-minute mile fibers that are very well aerobically adapted, they're the ones that are adjacent to, in the same vicinity of, in the quadricep muscle, to those 8-minute mile fibers that are producing a little more lactate because they're not quite as well aerobically adapted as the 10-minute mile fibers. So those 10-minute mile fibers are acting like the vacuum cleaner for the 8-minute mile fibers. And in the same way, those 8-minute mile fibers are acting like the vacuum cleaner for the next level up. And I was calling them the 6-minute per mile fibers. So I wanted to make it clear about that there's a reason to train at these different intensities, because you're improving the aerobic capacity of each one of those pools of muscle fibers that get recruited that do that level of work. And we don't have, in our mountain sports, it's not quite as simple as that. I mean, that explanation I was using would be great for somebody who was running on a track or on a road or something like that. We don't quite have that same, it's not quite as simple for mountain athletes, but the same idea is there. And so I hope you can understand why once you've developed a big base of aerobic capacity, you've made that the vacuum cleaner big in the slowest twitch, the most aerobically adapted muscle fibers, then it's kind of time to start working up the muscle fiber scale. And so once you've cured let's say the aerobic deficiency, which we haven't really spoken enough about yet, I'm going to talk more about that later. But once you've cured the aerobic deficiency and you begin to add intensity, this is why you do some zone 3 training, because now you're recruiting, my analogy, I'll use it again. Now you're recruiting those 8-minute or those 6-minute mile fibers, and they become the aerobic vacuum cleaner for the even faster fibers, the 5-minute per mile fibers or whatever. So it works on a macro scale and it works on a micro scale. And it's the reason, first, we want to cure the aerobic deficiency, but then this is the reason that once you've fixed the aerobic deficiency, you do start to add in higher intensity zone 3, zone 4 work. That's really when your endurance begins to improve. So I hope that I made that point clear. And I hope everyone's clear on these 2 metabolic pathways we have. I think I really drummed that into people's heads last time. And if you aren't quite clear, I think the book has a great deal of information on that. And if people can always ask questions on the forum, that I'm happy to answer stuff there so that the whole group can benefit from that. So the next thing we talked about was this pyruvate, which is the metabolic byproduct of anaerobic or glycolytic metabolism. And it's the fate of that pyruvate that really determines the endurance of an athlete. If the pyruvate accumulates, and basically pyruvate just becomes lactate. And lactic acid has this acid molecule and hydrogen ion attached to it, and they break apart. But you can think of lactate and pyruvate kind of in the same way. But it's the fate of what happens to that pyruvate or lactate that is a critical component in endurance. If you've got a big vacuum cleaner, then that pyruvate gets taken up into those, or the lactate gets taken up into the aerobic metabolism inside the mitochondria and used for energy, and there's no accumulation. There's no lactic acid buildup. There's none of that negative feedback loop. If, on the other hand, the vacuum cleaner is not big enough or the intensity is too high, eventually all of us reach this point where the intensity is too high, and the vacuum cleaner can't take up the pyruvate or lactate as fast as it's being produced. I've got some graphics on that I'll show you in a few minutes. Then it begins to accumulate and the athlete is forced to slow down. Doesn't matter how mentally tough you are, you will be forced to slow down because the glycolytic metabolism that's producing that pyruvate and lactate is fueled. There is going to be slowed down as those two byproducts accumulate in the cytosol of the cell. Will actually slow down the glycolysis. And since glycolysis is what's powering that higher intensity, faster running or whatever it is, as it slows down, you have to slow down. Then I'll talk a little bit about I kind of breezed through fat adaptation last time, but I think it's important to understand that when you are well fat adapted, that's the same thing as having a high metabolic flexibility. In other words, your muscles are just as happy burning fat as they are carbohydrates or glycogen, which is the stored form of those carbohydrates. And having that fat, being well fat adapted, having that metabolic flexibility allows you to use fat as a fuel. And as we might remember, the fat fuel tank is roughly 50 times the size of the the glycogen fuel tank. And so it benefits you to be well fat adapted and be able to use fat at higher and higher intensities. Partly because the higher the intensity, you can use fat and the aerobic metabolism, the less you have to deal with that buildup of lactate or pyruvate. But also in ultra long distance events, events lasting more than just 2 or 3 hours, that fuel tank is going to be the primary fuel source for the whole thing. And then we didn't really get much into aerobic deficiency, but I do want to speak about that tonight. So real quickly, some of the terminology we've covered. Aerobic capacity, that's essentially the amount of ATP that your body can produce where the aerobic pathways are the dominant source. And it's not how fast they can produce it. We'll get to that in a minute, but it's how much they can produce. The aerobic power, on the other hand, is the rate at which that ATP can be turned over. And this is also often called the oxygen uptake. You might have heard the term max VO2. I think we talked a little bit about that. If I didn't, I can cover it again tonight. The aerobic power, max VO2, is the combined rate of ATP turnover from both the aerobic and glycolytic pathways. It's not, the reason it's called the power is it's actually a rate. It's actually how fast it can be produced. Then the anaerobic capacity, similarly, it's how much ATP can be produced from the glycolytic or anaerobic pathway. And anaerobic power, which is something that generally we aren't too concerned about in these multi-hour type events, is how fast we can produce that ATP. And as you know now, when you're producing that ATP, there is a big buildup of lactate or pyruvate. And so the anaerobic capacity and anaerobic power, while they are important in most sports, they're of less importance when you get into these ultra long distance events. So I want to talk also a little bit about the confusing terminology. Aerobic threshold is the term that I've chosen to use on all my writing about this point where the maximum intensity where the aerobic metabolic pathway is still the primary source or the major source of, it's still doing at least 50% of the energy ATP recycling. Now, it's sometimes called the lactate threshold, which is incredibly confusing. I know, and I wish it wasn't like this. We can thank exercise science for not having any standardization in this. But if you happen to read lactate threshold, it sounds like it's dealing with a low intensity threshold, like what we call aerobic threshold. Be aware that that's not uncommon. It's not that common, but I've seen it a lot in literature. The other is the first ventilatory threshold, often written VT1. And that's because at this threshold, a change in ventilation, usually there's a kind of an abrupt change in your rate and depth of breathing at the aerobic threshold. That's why we can use something like a conversational pace or nose breathing as a marker for the aerobic threshold. Now, if you were in a testing lab, they could measure that more precisely and be more accurately in defining that first ventilatory threshold. The anaerobic threshold also goes by a bewildering number of names. Probably the most popular one is lactate threshold. So now we've got lactate threshold defining both of these metabolic events, which is really silly, but we don't have any control of that. So what you need to do when you're reading literature about this stuff is you need to be able to understand the context in which it's being used. And it's also often called the threshold. If you use the app that we use for our coaching, Training Peaks, when they talk about threshold, this is the threshold they're talking about, anaerobic threshold. It's often called if you're a cyclist or if you're a road runner, it can be called the functional threshold power or the functional threshold pace, FTP. And it can be the second ventilatory threshold, where at this point, again, if you were in a laboratory, it would be possible to measure kind of a pretty distinct and abrupt change in the ventilatory, the rate and depth of breathing. It's harder to define this from a ventilation standpoint without that laboratory equipment for this second threshold. But the one that actually defines it or explains it the best is this MLSS, which stands for the maximum lactate steady state. So this is the fastest speed or the highest intensity that you can operate where lactate can be taken up as fast as it's being produced. So maximum lactate steady state. In other words, your lactate is going to essentially remain in a steady state, and this is the maximum intensity that can happen at. So basically at that point, the vacuum is maxed out. So I hope that I wanted to kind of go through those because some of them can be a little difficult. Now I want to talk a little bit about aerobic deficiency, and because it comes up a lot. I've written quite a bit about it, and I hadn't encountered it before I started coaching recreational athletes, because typically well-endurance trained athletes don't have aerobic deficiency syndrome. I'll explain more about what it is in a minute, but essentially what it implies is that your aerobic system can't produce very much. It can't recycle the ATP very fast. As a consequence, it's requiring the anaerobic or the glycolytic metabolic pathway to step in to make up the difference between the ATP that's needed and the ATP that the aerobic system can produce. And this is very common with people who have not engaged in endurance training or who have done most of their endurance training at a high intensity. And one of the biggest reasons that we see this even in well endurance training, and I'll talk about that in a second too, is that these athletes, it's kind of I've only got 30 minutes to run because I got to go pick the kids up at soccer. So I'm just going to go out and run as fast as I can for 30 minutes. And then, so basically it ends up being, I'm going to run as fast as I can for as long as I have, as often as I can. So what happens with that is that the aerobic metabolic pathway gets this signal to it that it's really not needed that much, because the anaerobic pathway is getting this big training stimulus because it's having to make up the ATP deficit that the aerobic capacity can't make. So the anaerobic system, or the glycolytic metabolic pathway, gets a great training effect when you train at your endurance limit. Basically, again, if you run as fast as you can for 15 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour or 2 hours, it's going to be a different intensity, but it is essentially at your endurance limit for that length of time. And your body doesn't like to keep things that aren't useful to it. And so when you do this, the aerobic, since there's not a very powerful training stimulus that's going to the aerobic metabolic pathway, your body just goes, well, I guess we don't really need this. And so you stop producing mitochondria as fast. And mitochondria have a half-life of about a week. And so if they don't get frequent stimulus, and they die off and they don't get replaced by new mitochondria from more aerobic stimulus, then you end up with less and less mitochondria. And as you might remember, mitochondria are the aerobic engines of every cell in your body. So it's really important. Also, what happens is the enzymes that are used to break down fats, and all the aerobic enzymes, one of the big ones is they often use to determine aerobic adaptations is this enzyme called cytochrome C. When it's possible because it's easy to measure levels of cytochrome C. They can say, oh, this person's adapting well to aerobic training because their levels of cytochrome C are going up. And the levels go up when you get more mitochondria because that cytochrome C is inside the mitochondria. Now, so we've got this idea that the system that gets stimulated gets the training effect. And the reason many people who come to us are aerobically deficient is they've done most of their training at their endurance limit, and the aerobic pathway has been detrained, essentially. The good news is that this is probably the most adaptable part of your physiology. I mean, we are aerobic animals. This is our kind of genetic, or let's say evolutionary predisposition, is to we're aerobically predisposed, because you can prove this to yourself. Just hold your breath for, after a few minutes, you'll realize I need to take a breath here because your body depends on that oxygen. Now, there's only one way to fix aerobic deficiency syndrome, and that is to stimulate the aerobic system without overly stimulating the anaerobic system. That means we need to train at or just below the maximum capacity of the aerobic system to produce the ATP, as we've defined that as the aerobic threshold. And so by training at that, in that intensity realm, the aerobic system gets the big training stimulus. So it begins to improve its capacity, develops more mitochondria, and all the other effects that I've laid out in the books about the things that happen, like increased capillary density, that sort of thing. And the anaerobic system, because it's not being stimulated as much, begins to detrain, and you start to come back into a little more of a balance with this. It takes time. And one of the most frustrating things for people with aerobic deficiency syndrome is the depressingly slow pace that they may have to maintain. They probably will have to maintain when they're trying to fix this issue. And I'm going to tell a little story right now about a cross-country skier that came to me. This is quite a number of years ago, and he was one of the better skiers in America. Continuing off, placing in the top 10 in national championships and that sort of thing. And he asked me to help him with his training. And the first thing I did was, like I have had many, many people do, I said, let's do an aerobic threshold test. And he did this, and we determined that his aerobic threshold was about 135 heart rate and about an 8.5 minute mile pace. Now that's not very fast for an elite endurance athlete. And I said, ooh, boy, your top end is so overdeveloped. He had been doing so much high intensity training that he had a remarkable max VO2 of 92 milliliters per kilogram per minute, which is stratospheric. I mean, that's that's the number pretty close. That's kind of what Killian has. And it's very, very rare to see humans with max VO2s higher than, let's say, 80 to 85. So he was in this, 1/100th of 1% of endurance athletes in terms of his aerobic power. But remember, aerobic power is the combination of the aerobic system and the anaerobic system's ability to produce ATP. Now, he just had a massively well-developed anaerobic system, so he could really crank out the ATP. So I said, hey, Ben, we got to fix this problem. And when I first had him go out and train, he's kind of a big deal in this town he lives in because he's winning all these ski races. And he said, oh, I'm so embarrassed. I feel like I need to run with a bag over my head. Everybody's looking at me like, what's wrong with you? Why are you running so slow? But partly because he had a huge work capacity and he could do a lot of training. In about 4 or 5 months, we moved his aerobic threshold from 135 to about 165 heart rate. And his aerobic threshold pace dropped from an 8:30 mile to a 6:15 mile. So, over 2 minutes per mile increase. So by that time, we cured the aerobic deficiency syndrome, and we went on to this more intense training that he did need, because we'd made his vacuum cleaner as big as we needed to. And then that season, he qualified, went to the Olympics for the US. But it can be fixed, and it's not just beginners that get it. And it really only takes patience. I hope by this time everybody's realized this is not rocket science. I mean, there is no secret to this. All it means is you have to be patient. You have to put in a high volume of training below that aerobic threshold to move it up. Okay, let me see. I might have. Oh yeah, speaking of aerobic deficiency, I just got back a couple of days ago from a talk I did with this group is aerobically deficient. This is why I'm showing you this picture. I was invited to give a presentation at this international symposium for mountain warfare special operations groups. And down that lower picture is me giving this talk. And you could have, yeah, it was interesting because this whole group typically are aerobically deficient. It's very rare to find a soldier who's not aerobically deficient, because they kind of do that, you know, as they go as hard as they can, as often as they can, for as long as they can. But what I think I made a really good point with these folks when I explained to them, kind of like I've just explained to you, like the way this metabolic system works, the way you can't trick it, you can't train above that anaerobic threshold and fix aerobic deficiency syndrome. It's just not the way our physiology works. And so if you truly want to build this aerobic base, make that vacuum cleaner bigger, there's only one way. And again, it's not rocket science. There's no real secrets here. I've not discovered any magic. But this notion that somehow or another high intensity can replace this base volume and base work is completely misplaced. I mean, high intensity is very important for endurance athletes, absolutely, but it is a supplement to, not a replacement for, the base work. Now I'm going to show you 3 examples of this whole, testing the metabolic response to exercise in these 3 different cases here. In the lower left was actually a guy that John and I tested. This guy, oh gosh, it's been probably coming on close to 10 years ago now. It was in a clinic that John and I did in Portland, Oregon. And we had a bunch of folks come, and we actually got them on treadmills and we tested their blood lactates. This guy owned a CrossFit gym. So he did like CrossFit workouts 5 days a week. And there's nothing wrong with CrossFit, but a steady diet of it will do this to your metabolism. So you can see the blue line in these cases represents fat, the contribution of fat to the overall energy needs. The red line represents the concentration, the amount of carbohydrates that are contributing to the overall energy needs. Now you can see at this case, even at the lowest intensity, 50% of his max heart rate, he was already using 30% of his energy was coming from that glycolytic metabolic pathway using carbohydrates. And very rapidly, the contribution from fat dropped off. And this crossover point, where I've got these red arrows drawn on each one of these charts, is roughly where the aerobic threshold would occur. Now, if we had laboratory gas analysis and whatnot, we might be able to quibble over that, but in general, it's pretty darn close to what we call the crossover point. And so in his case, he had managed to kind of trash his aerobic system and push his aerobic threshold to a very low level. And again, there's nothing wrong with high intensity or even CrossFit, but done to excess, this is what will happen, and you will become massively aerobically deficient, like this guy was. Now, just to the right of that one over here, we've got a pretty well-trained recreational endurance athlete, and you can see that at rest or at very low intensities, the massive amount of the bulk of the energy is coming from the fat metabolism, the aerobic metabolism. And the crossover point occurs out there, about a little over 70% of the maximum heart rate in this case. And then as intensity increases, eventually, the carbohydrate or that analytic or anaerobic metabolic pathway dominates and even reaches 100% out there. In this case, it was at about 95% of the maximum heart rate. But this is a person who's done a pretty good job of improving their aerobic capacity, has moved aerobic threshold pretty far to the right. There's probably room to be moved even for this person at a recreational level. Above that, you can see a world-class athlete. where the aerobic threshold is way out there, 80 some percent of the maximum heart rate. And you'll notice that one of the interesting phenomenon here with this person, and this would be what we would see with any elite level endurance athlete, we will see this kind of metabolic use of fuels, that even at the highest intensity here, they are using about 10% of the energy is coming from fat, even at maximum intensity. And this was something that was thought to be impossible. Even just a few 10 or so years ago, I learned when I was starting to study this stuff a long time ago, that once you pass the anaerobic threshold, you were pretty much 100% carbohydrate fully into the glycolytic metabolism. And then a study was done by Steven Seiler, a very famous exercise physiologist, with some other guys, and they actually looked at elite athletes instead of just college students or who weren't well trained, and they found this phenomenon that elite athletes do use fat for fuel even at very high intensities. Now, remember, we got this massive fat fuel tank, so this allows this person to sustain a higher power output for longer durations here. And I haven't drawn the anaerobic thresholds in on this one, but in this case, if we were looking at this athlete here, well, actually, I've got another slide I want to show you in a couple of minutes that will demonstrate that, and it's right here. So aerobic deficiency, this would be what it would look like for an aerobically deficient athlete if we were to do a blood lactate analysis of them while they were running. Oh, excuse me, what happened? I switched slides. Sorry, I have to go back. Here we go. Okay, so here's what would typically look like. So on the horizontal scale, we have heart rate, but that could also be running pace or perceived exertion intensity, whatever you wanted. And on the vertical scale, we have lactate production. Now, the blue arrow represents the aerobic threshold in this person, and the red arrow, the anaerobic threshold in this person. So the aerobic threshold is where lactate first begins to start climbing up. And below in this zone, this is where lactate removal is, the vacuum cleaner is plenty big enough to suck up all the lactate production and recycle it. So you've got excess aerobic capacity up to that point. Now, after that aerobic threshold point, once you get into zone 3 here in the middle, now lactate production is gradually increasing. And at the upper limit, you reach that thing I was talking about a moment ago about maximum lactate steady state. That's right here at that red arrow. But in general, in zone 3, lactate, the vacuum cleaner is big enough to handle the lactate production until it gets to this red arrow, the anaerobic threshold or maximum lactate steady state. Once it gets there, the vacuum cleaner is no longer big enough. And so lactate production will exceed lactate removal rate. And as a consequence, lactate begins to build. And this is where, we've all felt it. This is where, once you get past this point, you are living on borrowed time. You can only sustain this intensity. A world-class athlete might be able to sustain this intensity for 6 to 8 minutes. Most of us will fatigue in the matter of 2 to 3 or 4 minutes once we get over this line. And of course, it depends on how far over the line you go. Out here, you might only be able to handle this for 30 seconds. So this is what an aerobically deficient athlete's metabolic profile would look like if we were to do a lactate test with them. When we look at an elite or very well-trained endurance athlete, we've got the same thing here. I've got heart rate, but again, it could be running pace, it could be anything, or any kind of intensity here. And on the vertical scale, it didn't carry over, but that would be lactate production. You notice how this person has very low levels of lactate, and they don't rise until they get out here. And there's this is a little bit of a tricky point to define. We use a test called the heart rate drift test to define this. It's a pretty good way to do it. It's a lot cheaper than going to a laboratory, but basically it's when lactate begins to climb over its baseline level. So you can see it's almost not changing for a long time and then starts to climb in here. And some people will say they'll use when it climbs 1 millimole per liter of blood lactate over its baseline level that you've reached a aerobic threshold. And there's some different definitions of this. It's not that important, but you understand this again, that this person's got this huge, this is when we talk about a big aerobic base, this is what we mean by a big aerobic base. All this intensity in here would be done in that aerobic realm. So you can imagine that, this person's going to be able to run at 155 or so, 150 heart rate for a whole lot longer than this person is right here. Because when this person hits 150 heart rate, they're fully into the red zone here. Oops, sorry, let me go back up to this one. Okay. Now, same thing applies here, where in this zone 3, we've essentially, the vacuum cleaner is capable of, it's right at its maximum limit, but it's capable of removing the lactate up to the red line, which is the maximum lactate steady state, beyond which the vacuum is no longer big enough and lactate begins to accumulate very quickly, and the athlete can't sustain this kind of intensity for very long. But I wanted to show this because I think it demonstrates, pretty well, the difference between, the not so well-trained endurance athlete with aerobic deficiency and what the potential is when you get rid of your aerobic deficiency. Now, this is not going to happen overnight, but we have seen over the past 10 years, so many people who send us emails and say, oh my God, when I first started doing this, I could barely jog or could not run. I had to walk. My heart, if I got above 110 or 15 heart rate, I was over my aerobic threshold. And, here I am a year later, I'm running at 140 and, I've dropped my average pace has improved by, in many cases, like 20, 30%. We see massive improvements. It does take time. But it does work. I have yet to see or hear of a non-responder to this type of training. And I think it's because we are so, evolutionarily predisposed towards endurance. This is something anybody can become good at this. Whereas if you don't have, I think I've mentioned this before, but there's an old saying in the track and the running coach world, and that is that sprinters are born, distance runners are made. Now, I think you can understand the implications of that is that we can take almost anybody, and by carefully training their aerobic system, you can improve their endurance and you can turn them into a distance athlete or endurance athlete. Whereas if you weren't born with a high percentage of fast twitch fibers and you don't have a kind of genetically predisposed towards anaerobic glycolysis, you're just not going to be a sprinter. I mean, there's no way in the world that you could probably take, a world-class endurance runner. We're never going to make a Usain Bolt out of an Eliud Kipchoge, who holds the world record in the marathon. Just probably is never going to happen because he wasn't born that way. Whereas Usain Bolt was born that way. Now, he probably could have become a better endurance athlete, but he would have sacrificed this because he had a huge gift. But anyway, I hope that's kind of clear that why I've chosen to show that this way. Let's see. Okay, back to this, some little more boring stuff here. So outside of the fuel tank is a good reason to be well endurance trained because you've got this huge fuel fat gas tank. Anytime you've got glycolysis, you've got pyruvate, and remember, pyruvate and lactate are kind of a negative feedback for that glycolytic system. We want to be fueled as much as possible by fat oxidation and as little as possible by the glycolytic metabolism. The famous coach that I often frequently reference and talk about, Yuri Verkhoshansky, he actually talked about this type of training as anti-glycolytic training. In other words, you're training to reduce the glycolytic metabolism and the effect it has. And interestingly, he wasn't training long distance athletes. He was training middle distance runners. So that was 800 to 3,000 meter runners. Now, so these were events that lasted from, a minute and 45 seconds to out to, maybe 8 minutes. So these are very short events compared to what we as mountain athletes and people doing ultra endurance events are dealing with on a regular basis. And yet he understood that even in these relatively short events, this anti-glycolytic training was crucial to move. And he talks about moving that aerobic threshold to the right, improving it, because that's what's, he didn't use the term vacuum cleaner, but he understood it. Now, I want to talk a little bit about economy, because this is a term that comes up a lot, running economy or just movement economy. There's two kinds of economy, but basically, first, what it means is it's just like in your car. It's how much energy does it cost you to move at a certain speed? Just as you know, your car gets worse fuel mileage the faster you go with it. Well, many people become less and less economical as their speed increases. There's two components to economy. One is the technical component. Now, is anybody who's watched a world-class runner and then maybe compared it to either themselves or somebody who's just taking up running and they see that sort of plodding gait, there's a huge difference in the technical economy, the technical efficiency of those the two techniques you're seeing there. The world-class runner has a very high technical proficiency, and so the energy cost for him or her is going to be much lower. Part of that comes from better technique, but it also comes from the elasticity of the connective tissues, especially the fascia and the tendons, so that when the foot strikes the ground, a good deal of the energy of that impact is absorbed in those tissues, and it's released again on the push off. So it's a little lot like a rubber band, taking some energy up and then releasing it. But there's also a metabolic a metabolic economy, and it's more economical to use the aerobic system for producing your energy than it is to use the anaerobic system. So we can improve economy through technical proficiency. Anyone who has skied a lot, whether it's ski-mo, cross country, these are very technically demanding sports. So there's a lot of technique that goes into that. Running, even though it doesn't seem like it ought to be very technical, it is. And in fact, some Swedes I read about a few years ago, they did a test they took a cohort of marathon runners who were around 2 hours and 20 minutes was their marathon time. So very fast guys. And they looked at their running economy. And the way they measure this is they put these runners on a treadmill and they measure the amount of oxygen uptake that it's taking to propel them at that. They were doing it at the race speed. So at that 2 hours and 20-minute racing speed. And what they found was there was a disparity of about 20% between the least to the most economically efficient energy economic or energy efficient use between those athletes. So that meant that some of them had to use a lot more energy to run that fast than others did. So it's a pretty significant component in almost every sport. Any of you who we train a lot of athletes on gym machines who then go into the mountains. And the gym machines are great for building fitness, but they don't build the kind of technical skills that you need for moving around on very rough terrain. You're not walking on a trail when you're climbing Mount Everest, or you're kind of our snowy trail. But anyway, it's very rough and uneven footing. And the movements, the movement patterns and the balance and the technical skills it takes to move well in alpine terrain, off trail, or even on very rough trails is very different than the kind of movement patterns that are developed when you're training on machines in a gym or running on a treadmill, that sort of thing. So you can build the fitness and economy in those realms, but you do need specific training to improve the economy in the event that you're training for. So like we often really try to encourage people to get into the mountains if they're training for some kind of big mountain event. Let me see here. Now, I didn't get into this last week. I think I brushed very quickly over it, but I want to talk a little bit about max VO2 and how it's misunderstood. Forgive my little play on words there at the top, but this energy cost, the amount of oxygen your body can take up and use at any given time I think it was first discovered, or not invented. I'm not sure how the technology was developed in around 1910. And then this guy, Archibald, I think was his name, Archibald Hill, British physiologist, decided to use it to test athletes. And it was crazy the level this guy went. We now can do, now we have these little boxes that, this not much bigger than your fist that you can wear on your chest that measure all this stuff. You can go out and run and you can get all this information. The way Hill had to do it is he had these guys running around a small courtyard, and they would breathe into these giant rubber balloons, and then they would capture the air in those balloons, the expired air in those balloons, and measure the percentage of oxygen versus this percentage of carbon dioxide in the air that these athletes expelled when they ran. And then he would increase the intensity, and he would try to find the maximum amount of oxygen that could be taken up by that person's body and used for that work. And they call this max VO2. And it is kind of an upper limit of it. It is, excuse me, not kind of, it is the upper limit of endurance capacity. The problem with it is, as I mentioned, when you're in that aerobic power realm, you're above that anaerobic threshold. You can't sustain a max VO2 intensity for more than a couple of minutes, 2 to 4 minutes, probably, for even the best trained athletes. It's just it's too expensive energy wise, and it got too much lactate buildup that comes with it. The biggest limitation to, and this wasn't discovered until probably 20 years ago by a guy that I know named Jim Stray-Gunderson, who's a doctor, exercise physiologist, PhD, and he discovered that cardiac output, the amount of blood that your heart could pump, was the main limitation to the maximum oxygen uptake. It's not out at the periphery, it's not out at those muscles, it's really right at the heart. And so this has some implications for us as we're training. The reason I'm talking about this, I want to talk about those implications. But the way you train to improve the cardiac output is by training above that red line as much as possible. That increases the cardiac output. It does this by increasing the stroke volume. It does it by increasing this thing called the Frank Starling effect, which is kind of the elasticity of the heart muscle. And so that's how you can improve it. Now, I have trained athletes like that fellow I mentioned earlier who had a max VO2 of 92, which is stratospheric for humans. Now, we're pretty puny on this scale. Racing greyhounds, I think, have max VO2s in the range of 300 to 400. I think race horses have a max VO2 in the range of 200 to 300. Hummingbirds, I think, have one of the highest max VO2s. I don't know how they measure it, put a little mask on them, I guess. But they're up in the almost 1,000 milliliters per kilogram per minute, but has something to do, I think, with their very light weight. But I have worked with people like this fellow I mentioned with a max VO2 of 92, who, even when he got to the Olympics, even with all the training we did, he was not competitive at a world-class level. I think his best result was 25th or so in the world, but wasn't super competitive, even with a number that, by the old way of looking at endurance, people would have said, "Oh, man, with a max VO2 like that, you should be world champion." And the people who are world champions, they do have that stratospheric max VO2. Killian being a perfect example of one. But on the other hand, and the reason I'm wanting to bring this up, because I think this is really an important point that's overlooked often. I have worked with very high level endurance athletes with really mediocre max VO2s, people who should not have been able to perform at the level they did, given this old model where max VO2 was considered the gold standard of endurance. One young woman that I coached for many years, a cross-country skier, was ranked 5th in the world for, I believe, 4 years running. And she had a max VO2 that was, I don't know everyone else's max VO2 on the World Cup circuit, but I would guess her max VO2 was about 60% of most of the girls on that racing at that level. And yet she was among the best in the world, and could from time to time win a race. Chances are, because she didn't have the maximum VO2, she was probably never going to become a world champion. She didn't have both of these things. And I'm going to explain why I think why that's important. I've also worked with another man, cross-country skier, who had a max VO2 that was rather, would be considered excellent be phenomenal for a recreational athlete, a good amateur at 75 milliliters per kilogram. But he's competing with guys with, max VO2s of 85 to 90. So it was quite low, and yet he could podium in World Cup races. So why is that so? Why isn't this a good measure of endurance? Why isn't max VO2 a good measure of endurance? Now, in a sport like cross-country skiing, it's probably even more important than most other sports, because cross-country skiing has moments when you're climbing steep hills for a short period of time where you can actually get into beyond that red line that I showed you in those charts. You can get out into that zone 4 and stay there for a couple of minutes on a climb. So you are going to be taxing that max VO2 limitation. But nonetheless, we still see these other athletes who did quite well with modest max VO2s. But in most of the events that we talk about, where these things are lasting hours, then you almost never go into that realm where you're close to the max VO2. Where you're operating mostly is in that zone 3 or just a little above zone 4 from time to time. Then you can drop back into zone 3 to recover, and you might bounce up and over that red line at the anaerobic threshold. But most of the race time is either going to be, if it's ultra long distance, like 6 to 20 hours, that range, then you're going to be spending most of your time in zone 2 with some forays into zone 3, and probably very tiny fraction of the race up into zone 4, because the cost would be so high for you to go into that intensity. You'd have to slow down to a walk probably to regain the homeostasis that your body needs to continue. And so why is this important to us? Well, in that zone 3, the best predictor of endurance is out in the muscles themselves, is not in the heart. It's the metabolic response to exercise that we've been talking about now. Last month, this month, I've written millions of words about this. That's why I concentrate so much. This is a thing we can actually have a huge effect on we can change the metabolism of those muscle fibers that are responsible for this endurance in that zone 2, zone 3 area, where we're going to be spending most of our time. So even if you didn't choose your parents as well as Killian chose his and come out with his incredible max VO2. I mean, a lot of max VO2 is just genetically determined. And much of it, the bulk of it, besides the genetic component, the big changes happen in childhood and through early adolescence. So you can make massive changes in cardiac output in young people and through the probably middle to upper teens, and then it begins to drop off and plateau. And with an elite athlete who's been training well, like those two that I was talking about before with rather modest max VO2s, there was no way we could change their max VO2. I had max VO2 records from them for years, and there was almost no change. Just even though their performance got better, their endurance performance got better, but that was because we concentrated on these other things. We tried to change the peripheral metabolism. We tried to change what was going on in the working muscles, rather than spending a lot of time trying to raise the max VO2 by 0.5%, for instance, whereas we could make we could make double-digit gains in endurance performance by concentrating on these, increasing the size of the vacuum cleaner and increasing the endurance in those zone 3 fibers. So that's why I think max VO2 is really misunderstood. It's often put out there like a horsepower figure in a car, like, oh my gosh, that's a huge horsepower in that car. It must be a very fast car. Well, I will say that having a high max VO2 is a little bit like being invited to the school dance. Okay, you got in the door, but that doesn't mean you're going to get to dance with the prettiest girl in the room. It just means that you got in the door. And there's other factors that come into play when it comes to improving that, and well, in this case, improving your chance of dancing with the pretty girl. But in terms of changing or improving your endurance potential, yes, if you have a high max VO2 like Killian or some other people, then you have the potential to raise your endurance to an extremely high level. But you're not going to do it by concentrating on max VO2. You're going to do it by concentrating on this, training these endurance qualities that we've been talking about. So I hope I've made that clear and not overdone it. But I think it's something that's I so often hear. I think I've already talked about this one. Okay, maybe I have actually exhausted this tonight. I am going to, I didn't want to start on the next chapter tonight. I wanted to finish the physiology chapter. And I've got a few minutes. If there's a couple of questions, somebody wants some clarification on something, why don't we spend our time doing that? And then next month, we're going to dive into how to do this stuff, how to improve, how to train these different qualities, how to improve muscular endurance, how to improve overall endurance, how to improve max VO2, those kinds of things. But anyway, I'm going to stop there tonight and open it up and see if there are any questions. And if they're not, we will say good night now. But you can put them in the chat if you'd like. And John, if you see any there that we need to hop into, oh, there's a couple right there. Yeah. Page turning stuff. Mark. Okay, Mark, is that okay? Is that a good thing? It's making you turn the page? I hope so. Mark is saying it's page turning stuff for a fitness nerd like him. And then, like, if you think of something later, you don't have questions now, a little concerned about, maybe asking questions in public, you can email me, Scott at Evoke Endurance. But I'd really encourage you to use our forum so that other people can benefit for this. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Okay. The second question, here's another question from Ian. I've always understood that you get faster at the same heart rate as your aerobic capacity increases, but you had mentioned that the heart rate would increase at aerobic capacity. Okay, I'm not sure I completely understand your question, but I think I can address it. So initially, when you take a person who's aerobically deficient and you're training in that aerobic zone that we were talking about, both the pace at that, let's say, aerobic threshold and the heart rate of aerobic threshold will increase kind of in lockstep. But eventually, as you can imagine, let me go back to my picture here with this guy here, the well-trained person. Move that out of the way. You can see that this guy his heart rate can't go much higher at aerobic threshold. It's going to start bumping into the anaerobic threshold. Now, a very well-trained athlete will often have only 10 to 12 beats difference between these two thresholds. That makes zone 3 very small. And so eventually, after you've cured aerobic deficiency, the aerobic threshold heart rate will not increase anymore. However, the pace at aerobic threshold can continue increasing for years and years. I've actually seen it improve for 10 years running. So this is why I say this is one of the most adaptable processes we have as athletes. And don't give up hope. Just be patient. It will happen. So Ian, I hope that answered your question. Heart rate will top out, but pace will increase. How obvious is aerobic deficiency from just taking a climbing partner out on a long distance run? Could your climbing partner talk to you the whole time? Could you carry on a comfortable conversation? If you couldn't, or if he or she couldn't, then there's a pretty good chance that and you were running at what for you would consider an aerobic pace. Then I would say, yeah, it probably is an indication of aerobic deficiency. If you can barely jog, and every time you hit a slight hill, you have to stop and walk, then there's a good chance that person's aerobically deficient. There's very easy ways to determine it. That heart rate drift test that I've written about, it's in an article on aerobic assessment on the website that you can easily do. You don't even need a Training Peaks account to do it, but the instructions are in there. But it's usually pretty obvious when somebody's aerobically deficient because they will be short of breath when they're running. Okay, Ian then asked, how does that affect training methods? Do you keep training at the same heart rate, or do you use another metric to keep yourself in the aerobic state? So that's a great question, Ian. And I didn't touch on this, and we need to talk about this. Sorry. So this person, this elite athlete, this well-trained endurance athlete, you can notice that when they're training, let's say obviously this heart rate would correspond to a running pace, like this heart rate would correspond to a running pace. These paces aren't very far apart. When you have an aerobically deficient athlete, like this person here, this is going to be this is the person who's going to complain about how ridiculously slow this pace feels at their aerobic threshold. And they can run right up next to this aerobic threshold all the time because muscularly it's not very hard work for them. So they can accumulate and need to accumulate almost all their volume actually in zone 2. Now, when you get to be well trained like this person is, and this running pace may only be, 15 or 30 seconds per mile slower than their anaerobic threshold pace, this is stressful training. Zone 2 now becomes difficult neuromuscularly. It's very powerful. It's very fast. And remember last week, I think we talked about aerobic threshold being the pace at which the marathon is competed. World-class marathoner, this would be a sub 5-minute mile pace right here. Now, that's why not most, but world-class marathoners train like 5% of their training is typically done at or faster than marathon pace because it's too demanding. It's too physically difficult. So they use, the well-trained athlete will not do almost any zone 2 training. They will do zone 1 for their aerobic base maintenance because they really can't improve their aerobic base much more. It's not going to get any better. Then they will do zone 3 training and zone 4 training to improve their endurance. So their training becomes more polarized and they kind of drop out this middle zone. But that's the exact opposite of the kind of training that this person needs to be doing. This person needs to be doing almost no training here, and all their training right now in this zone 2. So I hope that answers that, Ian, how it affects your training methods. But yet, so they're different for people who are aerobically deficient. Okay, for climbing and alpinism, does training your upper body anaerobically impact your leg? No, it does not. It does not impact your legs' muscular performance. It's only the fibers that are being trained that get the training effect. So, you can do all the, hard boulder problems and pull-ups you want, and it's not going to change your the aerobic capacity of your legs for alpine climbing. Although I will say there is a good deal of benefit of improving aerobic capacity in full body movements like alpine climbing or like any kind of climbing. Most of that aerobic capacity is going to come in forearms and upper body. And some of you may have seen the book that was published about the time we published Training for the New Alpinism. I think it's called Training for Rock Climbing. It's written by the Anderson brothers. I've forgotten the exact title, but two brothers, Anderson is their name, and they're exercise physiologists. And they understand that it's important or it is beneficial to lay an aerobic training base, especially in the forearms. So that's what they call arcing. What is it? Aerobic something or other climbing. But it's basically climbing continuously for many minutes at a time to develop all those muscles, forearms to shoulders and back, that sort of thing, develop the aerobic capacity of those muscles, so that then when you layer on the harder anaerobic work that's needed to climb extremely hard climbs, you have the vacuum cleaner is available, just like the vacuum cleaner in your legs. So anyway, hope that makes sense. Okay, so someone with ADS, does all training need to be done in zone 2? No, I would, if you have ADS, you're going to get a lot more benefit from training right up next to that aerobic threshold. It will be more effective. However, there will be days in which you're going to feel tired. That some days that, that same heart rate or that same pace at aerobic threshold is going to be challenging because you haven't recovered well for whatever reason, stayed out too late and got drunk. You're getting sick, or you didn't sleep well that night, or you did too much volume in the previous days, and you exceeded your capacity for that kind of aerobic work. And on those days, then you should shift to zone 1. It won't be quite as effective as raising the aerobic threshold as zone 2 will. But if you train in zone 2 on those days when you're really tired, you do risk overtraining. So pay attention to how it feels. And if you're feeling really good, then train in zone 2. But if it's a struggle to get your heart rate up to that level, or to get your running pace up to its normal speed at aerobic threshold, that's your body telling you, hey, I'm tired. I'm not ready for this. And it won't benefit from that if you forced, our body doesn't like to be bludgeoned into things. It likes to be gently encouraged to make changes. And so, listen to it, take that feedback for what it is, and go easy on those days. And a walk is for real recovery. A brisk walk is a great recovery session, actually. Okay, well, this has been fun, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I hope people came away with something from it. I didn't actually expect to spend the whole hour on tonight. I thought we'd rip through all that stuff in a half an hour. So I'm glad I was able to expand on some of those things. But next month, we're going to dive into training methods starting next month. How do you train this kind of stuff, and why do you train it the way you do? But I guess that would be all for tonight. Thank you all for attending. I really do appreciate it. It's been great having you here. Thanks for your patience with me. So anyway, good night, and see you guys next month.